is Jason J. Rock Huston, and you're listening to Chaotic Risk Magazine. We can be found on the web at www.chaoticrisk.com. Our special guest, once again, is singer Gar Borras from the Los Angeles-based Guns N' Roses tribute band, Appetite for Destruction. And today we're going to be speaking with Gar for our new On the Record segment, where we're going to be talking about Black Sabbath's 1970 debut album. Welcome to the show once again, Gar. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good.
Hanging in there, huh?
About Black Sabbath, boy, that was a big influence for me.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that now. So far, we talked about some of your other influences. One being Alice Cooper, and another being Pink Floyd, and today Black Sabbath. So your influences are kind of all over the place. Very, very interesting. Now, Black Sabbath is kind of like gloom and doom. It's what people really typically think of metal. So why don't you share with us how you first got into this album and Black Sabbath specifically?
Well, at that time, as a kid, I was always looking for music to learn with and to kind of expand, what I did, because at a young age, I think we talked about it before in other interviews that in my early years, I wasn't a singer, I was a bass player. And I was always looking for stuff to learn with. Mm-hmm. And Black Sabbath, of course, I always gravitated towards the type of music that had, the rock thing going on, with the distortion and, the guitars and all that kind of stuff. But at that time, Black Sabbath's music was a lot different than what it kind of evolved into.
Oh, yeah.
If you listen to early Black Sabbath, when they would go into guitar solos, it was kind of a common occurrence. If you listen to the music, that there was a lot of improvisation that was going on during the guitar solos.
Yeah.
It kind of left the structure of the song and became kind of improvising, and then would go back into the song.
Yeah.
After the guitar solo was over, and it was I noticed that because when I was trying to learn how to do it, everything was kind of structured, and all of a sudden they would go into the guitar solos, and it was really obvious there was some freewheeling going on.
Yeah.
And later on, when they started becoming more successful, that kind of left. They stopped doing that, and then the guitar solos were much more structured and things like that. So it just gave me an opportunity to learn song structures, but it also gave me an opportunity to learn how to freewheel and kind of just, start doing some improvisation. And
of course, Tony Iommi, of course, is ultimate riff master, and he's a huge reason for the Sabbath sound, because as you many Sabbath fans, I'm sure, are aware, early on, like when he was a teenager, he worked in a, he got the tip of his fingers cut off with a saw or something, and that's why he plays the guitar that way. I don't know if you've ever noticed that he plays kind of with the tip of his fingers, and that's kind of why they play with that heavy D sound, and kind of sounds like it's tuned down. But that's a huge reason for the Black Sabbath sound.
He didn't let it stop him.
Yeah.
He actually turned it into something, it's kind of like turning lemons into lemonade.
Oh, yeah, I mean, people kind of argue, and they give the credit to Tony Iommi, you actually, created heavy metal music. You created, a genre of music, and sometimes Steppenwolf will take the credit, we were the first ones to use a word heavy metal in a song. But whatever the case may be, I mean, I really can't think of anybody that was close to having that metal sound before Sabbath came along.
I don't either, and I think that's the truth of the matter, is because I was around and I was always hungry for new material, and when Black Sabbath hit, the radio airwaves, and they really did change that whole thing, and they really did create that heavy metal sound.
Yeah, and Black Sabbath too. The thing about them, especially when they first came out, this first album, it's the first time anybody's ever heard of Black Sabbath, and they were so anti establishment, meaning like you'd never really seen or heard anything like this band before, or really, since. Everything that's kind of come after. There's a bunch of copycats in my book, but it's kind of interesting because they really had no image, and they were one of those bands that they were really opposite of everything else that was out there at the time.
Yeah, and it's kind of trippy how they kind of came into the name Black Sabbath, and by coming into the name Black Sabbath, it affected their songwriting, where everything started becoming darker. Yeah,
and oddly enough, the guy besides Tony Iommi that's really responsible for a lot of early Sabbath sound and those early Sabbath songs is the bass player Geezer Butler, because it was actually Geezer was a principal songwriter back in the day, not Ozzy Osbourne, and he wrote like a lot of his songs were based on scientific theories and things like that, and just the occult and stuff. And it's kind of interesting that it was Geezer that wrote all those early Sabbath songs.
Yeah. Well, I was from a very, very young age. I was always when I started hearing distorted guitars, and it got my attention. There's Black Sabbath was a big part of my learning how to play bass. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just their debut album. Yeah. It was like their first 3 albums.
Yeah, and before the egos really got in the way and they were still like real tight as friends and stuff, I mean, those early Sabbath albums, that's the thing is all 4 guys really equally brought something to the picture, and you could see that. And even before the drugs kind of really started to affect the guys playing and stuff, but Geezer Butler was a huge part of Sabbath for me. Not just his songwriting, his bass playing, but I mean, just everything about the guy. I mean, perfect example. There's a song on here, Nib. That's really
Nativity in Black.
Nativity in Black. He's really responsible for that. I mean, just listen to the bass throughout that song. I mean, especially you being a bass player. I mean, you can feel the bass all through that song.
Well, bass was a big part of their sound. Yeah. That's where the deepness in their sound came from.
Oh yeah, and I'll give you a little interesting facts I found out when getting ready to do this today. If you can believe this or not, this album was recorded in a single day.
That doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, and I guess the recording session took a total like 12 hours, but again, like you said, that does. I mean, tell Axl Rose to record an album in a day,
Well, yeah, that's really kind of hard to fathom. But when back when I was doing originals, I kind of remember having those same kind of constrictions when we were doing demos. Because everybody that's trying to get signed to a record label is forking out money to go into recording studios to do demos, and you would have the same kind of constrictions in doing so much preparation before you go into the studio, because the last thing you wanted to do when you went into the studio was run into snags, because snags would eat up time, and then now instead of 4 songs, you're doing 3-song demo, things like that. Or you run into really bad snags, then it becomes from a 4-song demo down to a 2-song demo.
Yeah.
So there's so much pre-preparation. Yeah. So when you go in, everybody knows exactly what they're going to do, and now it's just getting that take.
And the technology wasn't what it is today back then. And if you look at it too, you stop and realize, okay, the album only has 7 tracks on it, so that might play a role in why they were able to get it done so fast. But it doesn't have 9, doesn't have 10 or 12 tracks. It has 7. But again, with those 7 songs on their debut album, they made quite the statement.
Well, yeah, they obviously they did, because look at not only did they become a very successful band, but they became a band that influenced so many other bands.
Yeah. And I'll give you an interesting fact here. The song, one of the songs on here, "Evil Woman," if you may find this hard to believe, I don't know, not actually a Black Sabbath original. Come to find out, it was originally done by a Minneapolis blues-based band by the name of Crow, and they were kind of in existence from 1967 to 1972. Never heard of them, but Black Sabbath's version became much more famous.
Well, just like when Van Halen did their debut album,
"You Really Got Me," yeah.
"You Really Got Me." Yeah. There's always going to be, certain bands, that pretty much do their own material, but throw in a cover of this, or a cover of that.
And it's interesting because that is one of their more memorable songs, and Black Sabbath, like I was talking about, besides the music, they were really anti-everything. I mean, they were really against having any kind of image. Their image was really kind of just, we're dark, and then they started to get this reputation, and they kind of went along with it. People start saying, "Oh, Black Sabbath, they're devil worshippers, they wear black." And then Tony Iommi was saying, and Geezer over here, I read interviews where he'd say, "Yeah, when all that stuff started to spread, we kind of went with it. We wore nothing but black. We messed with people's heads by wearing crosses and around our necks, and they'd be like, wait, are these guys devil worshippers? Are they Christians? What are they?"
Yeah, but at that time, that was during the hippie time, and there was, at that time, Black Sabbath was in such contrast, because
everything else.
When you think about it, the hippies were all like look at the pictures from way back then, the way everybody was dressed, and the flower children and that whole thing, and then all of a sudden Black Sabbath hits and it's like dark.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because even if you look at like old magazine photos that were taken of the band back then, most of the pictures that were taken, I don't know if this was an intentional thing or just the way it turned out, but most of those old classic photos of the band were all taken like in black and white film for the most part and stuff. And then a few years down later, when they started taking colorized photos, it looked kind of really different, but interesting at the same time.
Well, but they were young, and they were kind of developing at that time.
Oh yeah.
Because when you listen to those first 3 albums, it's once they started getting more money behind the band and everything, their albums started having a more sophisticated sound.
Yeah, it's kind of like it reminds me of what I really love about Black Sabbath at that time is none of it was contrived. It was really who they were. They weren't trying to have an image. They weren't trying to be anti-image. That's just kind of who they were. This is the music we make. This is what we look like. Kind of very much like you could see very much that Metallica is another band that was influenced by Black Sabbath, especially if you go back to those first 3 albums.
There you go. That's another. There's no way you're going to convince me that Metallica wasn't influenced by Black Sabbath.
Yeah, and very much to the point that I remember on those first 3 albums, the last one with Cliff Burton being the Master of Puppets album, they're still very heavy. They'd not done like a single music video that they were still kind of against that. But they're like, oh, we're never going to do a music video. We're never going to do this. But once that little bit of success came their way, and you can't really fault them. And I think they did some pretty decent like music videos and stuff. But so you very much can see like with bands like I would say Metallica and definitely like Pantera once Phil Anselmo came into the picture and they got a lot heavier. So you definitely see the influence in other bands.
Well, I mean, even people like me.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I listed it on my Facebook.
Yeah.
That it was one of those
albums.
Influential albums, is because they I really, I can't express enough about how much I used to have like all three of their first albums.
Yeah.
And back in those days, when you were trying to learn what they were doing, basically what I kind of taught myself how to play bass.
Mm-hmm.
And which means that I play totally by ear. I really had no technical schooling.
Yeah.
I just had this drive to
do it. Yeah.
I had somebody that showed me how to tune a bass, and then once the bass was in tune, then I was kind of figuring out where the notes were and how the patterns went. And stuff like that. But back in those days, it was done with a record player with a needle.
Oh, people,
And you would have to lift that needle and go back and try to go over it, and then try to lift it, and then go back, and then try to lift it and go back. And then the next thing you know, I ruined all three of those albums. Literally, they reached a point where, lifting that needle, it leaves mark. It's a needle.
Yeah. And the needle eventually wore out.
So there's a lot of albums that I ruined back in those days.
Yeah.
But the investment, for the albums, turned out because I wound up learning how to play bass, and I learned how, to, improvise, and I learned how to do things that eventually went on to become what I did once I started getting into playing in bands and things.
Yeah, and you was talking about playing a record and having a turntable back in the day. It wasn't as easy just getting it on a CD and putting in your CD player. And I want to just listen to the song I heard on the radio. I just want to. You actually had to, for the most part, play the album from top to bottom and really kind of just digest the whole thing. And that's how people used to listen to music back in the day.
Oh, how well I know. That movie Almost Famous.
Oh, yes.
Really does kind of capture what it was like to be a person that was into music back in the 70s, which is my time when I was a kid, and I was doing that exact same thing.
Those are the days, man.
I would imagine I'm probably the same age as Cameron Crowe, the guy that made that movie. And, just basically when bands would come out with their albums, everybody would be waiting in anticipation for it to come out, and then going to the record store,
trying to find it.
Once you bought it, you took it home and you immediately took it out and put it on the record player, and while it was playing, you're reading every single thing on that album, including the sleeve that went around the record.
Oh yeah, I mean from who designed the album cover to who the songwriters were to additional musicians and all that and
virtually everything.
That's what I miss about like Tower Records. That was one place you used to be able to go. You could find almost any official release a band had out. Whereas like I can go to maybe the local Target and I might be able to find Black Sabbath's greatest hits or the Beach Boys' greatest hits. But for most of my music love these days, I have to either go through a band's website, which I don't mind doing because then you get to support the musician and the bands that you love, or a lot of times I have to get it off of Amazon. But again, I'm kind of one of those guys that whatever you have to do to support the bands out there and that you love. And also this was a time back in the day where, like when you were first discovering a band like Black Sabbath, it was a band of 4 guys that had, when this album was being made, this Black Sabbath album, a debut album, they were 4 lads from, out of Birmingham, England. They'd never stepped foot into the U.S. at that point. And for a band like that to kind of come over from a little town in England and start touring a Source album, not just to the United States, but eventually around the world. That was a big thing back in the day.
Well, I mean, what a way to make a living.
Yeah, it really is. And all they had to do was record one album in one day and those 7 songs, but I'm sure it took them much longer to write those songs. Now, you obviously, being a bass player, you mentioned kind of paying attention to what Geezer Butler was doing and being a fan of Tony's riffs and everything. But how much back then, when you first picked up this album, were you paying attention to Ozzy as a vocalist and what he was doing vocally?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Because to be honest with you,
yeah.
I really never paid that much attention to what they were
singing.
Any band that I listened to, what they were saying, what the lyrics were about.
Yeah, it didn't even really matter
for most people that really get into bands and stuff like that. They become emotionally involved in the actual lyrics that sing.
Yeah.
Stuff. My approach to music was much more focused on the instruments.
Obviously, yeah.
And so I never really paid that much attention to what they were talking about, what they were saying. If anything, because I did have a voice and I did have the ability to sing, but my focus was more. For a long time in my musical career was just doing backup vocals.
Yeah.
And so,
which that can also
which is a really kind of a cool step towards singing. Simply because the difficulty of doing backup vocals was learning how to sing something that is a different pattern from what you're actually playing on an instrument, and being able to do both of them and have them synchronized together, where it all works in time and flows with the song and everything like that. And that's it was when you're in the beginning and you've never done it before. It's kind of a cool challenge. But then again, having a musical instrument that you're playing also allows you as a singer to develop your ability to hear the note and hear if you're right on the note or if you're a little bit off the note, because you have your musical instrument. If you can tune a musical instrument and you can play and you can hear when you're playing it right on your instrument, and you can hear when you're actually hitting a wrong note, that means you've developed an ear, because your ear is the thing that points out to yourself that, oh, that's the wrong note. I need to correct that. And so, playing bass and doing backup vocals allowed me to develop into those first steps into developing and being a singer. But that was about it. I would only focus on knowing the lyrics that they're singing during the times that the backup singer's singing. The rest of the stuff that they're singing in the verses and all of that stuff, I'm not even paying attention to. I have no idea what they're talking about.
And it's interesting because a background vocal sound of a band can be very key. I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. Van Halen, especially the original lineup with Michael Anthony. I mean, he was the background sound of that band. I mean, there's nobody better for that job. That guy, he was able to play bass, and he's able to.
He had a very distinct sound to his voice too. Because when you hear those backup vocals, if you took him out of it and you had those exact same vocals done with a different voice, it would have sounded different. That's a really good point about Van Halen and Michael Anthony.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting talking about Ozzy Osbourne's ability as a vocalist, because Black Sabbath is a very interesting band in that, like I said, Tony and Geezer did a lot of the writing. They would write around Ozzy's voice, and Ozzy, he's not a horrible singer. In fact, I think his vocal style very much fits a band like Black Sabbath. But if you've noticed, even on his solo albums, Ozzy's smart in that he always surrounds himself around very talented musicians, and a lot of those guys in his band, they're very involved with the songwriting and that, and that's why he's been able to have so many hit songs as a solo artist and all that. But Black Sabbath, I mean, like you said, when you listen to those old Black Sabbath records, you don't even really care what is a song is about, or you're not listening lyrically, or are they writing a song about trying to save a world or world peace or anything. You're just like, no, I'm getting down with the groove, man. It's a cool sound, And
really, that's pretty much it. I was getting down with the groove.
Yeah, and now being that you're start out in the bass and you primarily focus, I'm sure, a lot when you listen to music on the rhythm section. What did you think about Geezer and Bill Ward as a rhythm section, and specifically Bill Ward on the drums?
Well, in their early material, the parts that really were challenging were when during the guitar solos, because that's where the bass and the drums would be doing a lot of improvising. And so to kind of grasp about improvising can be I think one of the most difficult things to do musically is mastering improvising. Because there's it's really hard to describe, because there's a basic structure that you're following when you're improvising, but you're purposely taking each round that you're going around in this repeat of things that you're doing. In each round that you're going around, you're doing it differently each time. You're not repeating exactly the same thing you did the first time around in the second time around, and then the third time around you're doing something, and it just really, I had no idea at that time that it was exposing me to that. I was just okay, this is what they do, so I got to learn what they do. But improvising became something, another band, way back in the late 60s, that was doing a lot of improvisation was Cream. And that was another band that exposed me to improvisation, and because they had song structures and stuff like that, but then when they would go into guitar, just seemed like in the late 60s there were a lot of bands that when they would go into the guitar solos, there would be a lot of improvising and stuff like that, and they would just go off into like tangents, and then somehow they knew what they were doing, and they would wind up going back into the song, and they would record it, and it all sounded like it was meant to be.
And just to give you a little note on Bill Ward here for a minute, I've read over the years that he actually, interestingly enough, he wasn't, when Sabbath was formed, he wasn't really much of a rock drummer or anything like that. He had studied mostly like jazz and was pretty much a jazz musician, and he kind of, like you said, improvised and kind of became what Sabbath needed, over the years.
That's a big part of jazz. That's the biggest reason why a lot of people really don't understand jazz, is because jazz will have an underlying structure with a lot of, where the underlying structure is kind of invisible to the listener, because it's not being, in the forefront. It's really kind of buried, but the musicians know this structure, underlying structure, but then everything you're hearing is all improvising over underlying structure that the listener's not really even aware of, but the musicians are.
Yeah.
But so when the listener is listening to jazz, all they're hearing is all of this improvising and stuff like that, but a musician, when you understand jazz, you understand how proficient you have to be able to do all of that improvising over an invisible underlying structure of music. You really appreciate how incredible of a musician you have to be able to pull that off. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. That's the reason why I was saying is improvising, is a very, very difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
But when you become really, really good at it, it just makes you so much stronger as a musician, and gives you so much more to pull from later on when you're being creative, because you have all of this stuff that you've experimented with and freewheeled with and everything like that. It really allows a musician to become so much more creative than a musician that doesn't have a improvisational background.
On that note, I'd like to
when
ask,
I started doing originals, it was the biggest thing that allowed me to make that bridge from jumping from covers to doing originals, because when you're trying to come up with stuff, for this particular song that you're writing with this band, you have to be able to come up with a bass playing out of your back, bass line out of your back pocket.
Oh yeah.
And having improvisational background allowed me to be able to do that transition and have a much smoother transition and be able to do a good job.
And on that note, let me ask you, Gar, I don't know if you ever have or if you've ever considered, like, most people know Gar Borras as, from your Guns N' Roses tribute band, Appetite for Destruction, and you've done your own original music thing, like you were saying. That's primarily what you're known for, like, as a hard rock guy. But if somebody, if a project came up or something, somebody said, hey, Gar, I'm putting together, like, this tribute CD to Willie Nelson or something, and I'd be interested in seeing if you could do, like, a country song. Would you even imagine just kind of attempting to do it, or are you kind of like, well, no, I'm more of a hard rock guy, I want to stay away from country, or would you kind of be interested to see, like, if you could do it, or even if it came to getting, like, a, paid gig or something where somebody needed, a bass player or singer for a country tribute or something, would you give it a shot and say, well, it's a paid gig, why not?
Well, I had played bass for such a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, most people nowadays don't even know me that I even used to play bass or or had that whole background.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't. There's very little that I would be afraid to take on.
Yeah, there you go.
I just, my musical influences. Yeah, of course, I gravitated towards hard rock and heavy metal.
Yeah.
When I was young, but when I was the very first band that I was in was all improvisation.
Oh, wow.
And we did, that's all. We used to do shows and get up and play for an hour or an hour and a half, and it was all improvisation.
Wow, amazing.
But those musicians that I was working with were heavily jazz influenced musicians, and those were the guys that introduced me to the guys that were the heavy hitters in jazz at that time, like Return to Forever, Stanley Clarke, John McLaughlin, Jean-Luc Ponty. Yeah. So they introduced me to the world of jazz, and I ate that stuff up too.
Yeah. Wow.
That was, after my, I would say that was more in the 70s.
Oh wow!
You know, say the mid 70s, that I started becoming exposed to high levels of jazz. And boy, when you're trying to learn how to play stuff by those guys, it's very intimidating.
Yeah, wow.
Because their level of musician is just so stratospheric.
It's almost trying to take on Beethoven.
That type of stuff will put you in your place and really let you let you know really how good you are.
Yeah, I also think if you're able to do that, like an improvise, it shows your gift as a musician. It shows your gift that kind of like to adapt to any situation, like you're saying, because there are some guys that are willing to do that, and then there are other guys that are like, no, I'm just a hard rock guy. I won't do nothing but metal. But
No, I could pretty much take on anything. If I wanted to play country, if I wanted to play blues, if I wanted to play this, or if I wanted to play that, no, I wouldn't be afraid to do anything.
And to me, that's
unfortunately, my hands. I've developed carpal tunnel and things like that. So that's the biggest reason why I started singing. A lot of people don't know that is because there was a time that I would play my bass, and after playing for maybe about 15 or 20 minutes, the tips of my fingers would go numb. I realized that I was there was no way that I was going to stop playing music.
Wow.
But I wasn't going to be able to continue playing bass, so I just started singing.
That's very interesting.
The whole thing was at that time, I'd say it was like the early 90s.
Wow.
I would go to a place in Covina that was a popular place for the musicians to hang out on a Wednesday night.
Wow.
It was a place called Rude Dogs on Citrus Avenue, and they would have a jam night on Wednesday nights, and I would go over there, and I would tell people, I'm thinking about jumping over, to being a singer, and nobody would give me the time of day as a singer. They would basically just say, you're a bass player. Grab the bass over there. Get up there and play bass.
Yeah. Interesting.
And, so nobody would give me the time of day as far as like giving me a chance to sing.
Yeah.
So what I did is I found a guitarist that I was comfortable playing with, and I found a drummer that I was comfortable playing with. And so what we did is we would take a cassette tape, because this is before CDs and this is before the digital time, and we would put 3 songs on that cassette tape, and then I would learn the bass stuff, and I would learn the vocals, and then I would play bass and sing, and then we would go back on Wednesday night. We would get up at our time to play 2 or 3 songs.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I would be playing bass and I'd be singing, and then all of a sudden all these people that would sit there and say, "Oh, you're a bass player, you're a bass player."
Wow.
Oh, he can sing.
Wow. Listen to that.
That was my turning point where people realized, oh my gosh, he can sing.
Oh, he can.
But up until that point, nobody would give me a shot at singing.
And then I imagine once you started singing, eventually people also could see, oh, wait a minute, he can write a song. That's great.
Oh gosh, it was pretty funny.
You work with what you got, though.
And that's when I started singing, and I started developing my skills as a singer.
You work with what you got, which I just love that, and you kind of educated me, because I think like a lot of people, as foolishly as this may sound, I had no idea of that like a bass player, a guitar player could get carpal tunnel as well, because you really just hear about drummers. For example, Peter Criss, the drummer from Kiss, he's not really able to play like he used to, and I heard since he left Kiss he hasn't really gone on the drum kit too much because he's not really physically able to do it because he suffers from that. But I never knew like a bass player that could suffer from that.
Well, yeah, bass, yeah, because the strings are real fat.
Wow.
And there's a lot of tension on those strings because the neck is real long.
Yeah.
And so it takes more physicality to play bass.
Yeah.
You know, it really takes, to be able to do a lot of the things that I used to do on bass when I was, really getting crazy good at playing bass. You know, it took some physicality to do it too.
Yeah, like did you play the bass like kind of like Nikki Sixx, more like a guitar player, or were you really into the groove? Did you play with a pick? What was your style?
In my early years, I played with my fingers, just like a traditional bass player. I'd say for the first 10 years that I played bass, I played the traditional with your fingers.
Wow.
But then, I discovered Yes.
Yeah.
And the bass player for Yes, his bass lines were much more like orchestral rock bass lines.
Yeah.
They weren't just rock bass lines, but they had more of an orchestral how they went, how they flowed with the song.
Wow.
Which was very, very different than what a rock bass player would do.
Yeah.
And he played with a pick.
Wow.
And so that made me realize, there's some of the things that he was doing that were double picking that, it's just, it's just almost impossible. It's doable, but you can do it so much better if you do it with a pick.
Yeah.
And that's when I started picking up the pick, and I started learning how to do all of these different things, like double picking and stuff like that. And once I moved over to picking, it opened up a whole nother a whole bunch of new doors to me in being able to apply new things to playing bass, because there was a lot of things that it just opened up a whole bunch of new doors for me as a bass player.
Wow. Now let me ask you, from we've been talking about Black Sabbath and that debut album. Now, by the time 1979 comes around and Ozzy's leaving the band, just right as Dio's getting ready to come into the band, did you remain a Black Sabbath fan, or once Ozzy left, did you kind of say I'm moving on to something else?
No, I mean, I like their stuff even when, I think for a short time, Ian Gillan from Deep Purple, sang with them for a short amount of time.
Now, I could see that, because Ian Gillan, oddly enough, it did not sound like, Black Sabbath fronted by Deep Purple or nothing like that. In fact, I think in many ways, that one Sabbath album, which I think is called Born Again, they got even heavier with Ian Gillan.
Well, I just, they still never lost that whole Black Sabbath, what made, Black Sabbath musically, because, Ozzy, extremely talented, great voice and everything like that. But, when he wound up leaving, they still wound up being very successful, which is, showed you that, they weren't just a band that was popular just because of the singer.
Yeah, and
there's a lot of bands that once the singer leaves that band, then all of a sudden the band's just like loses, their footing, and usually the band, a lot of times you'll see the singer goes on to success and the band kind of goes by the wayside. Yeah. But that didn't happen to Black Sabbath.
I know, interesting enough, if you remember back then, when Ozzy first left, everybody thought, oh no, Sabbath is over. And it's amazing because they went on to even like bigger and greater success, if you can believe that, with Dio. And see, if you compare Dio to Ozzy, they're like two different worlds. I mean, one thing, like Dio's lyrics, like all about heaven and hell and demons and witches and all that stuff, but he was very involved with the writing, so it was not just Geezer and Tony, writing the the songs, and I've always been a huge Ronnie James Dio fan, and I think part of the reason I think is because that's when I first got into Sabbath, was when I'll never forget hearing that Heaven and Hell album for the very first time.
Do you know about the origination of the heavy metal sign, right? With your hand,
oh, that's Ronnie.
Your index finger and your pinky finger, and then the other middle two fingers being held down.
Ronnie James Dio.
Do you know the story behind that?
Well,
everybody knows that it came from Ronnie James Dio.
I heard it started
it goes a little bit deeper than that.
Okay,
do you know about that story?
No, all I know is it started like when he was playing with Rainbow.
Well, okay. People asked him, well, where did that come from? Where did you come up with the idea? Well, when Ronnie James Dio was real young, he used to have either an aunt or a grandmother, and I believe that they had some gypsy background, and she used to do that with her fingers, and what I was told, it was to ward off evil spirits.
Wow, that's
and there was actually a name to it. It was called the Maloik.
There you go. I've heard him talk about that. And it's kind of, I'll tell you another interesting thing about Ronnie James Dio. You can look this up on the internet later when we get done. If you go look up on YouTube, you type in like I think Ronnie James Dio and the Prophets. It's a band he had like even before Elf, and he looks so straight-laced. He looks nothing like a metal singer. His hair was short and everything, and it's like really different type of music. And oddly enough, I don't know if you know this, while Ronnie James Dio is known, of course, for being the great lead singer and songwriter that he was, he started out on the bass. A lot of times, like when they would record demos and stuff, he would record like bass parts and stuff on the demos and stuff. But he was actually a bass player in that before he was ever a singer.
I guess I'm not the only one.
Yeah, and another interesting point is we'll be talking to you about another one of my famous artists. Maybe a few weeks from now, Edgar Winter. What I always dug about that cat was he was kind of like a very underrated artist. And interesting thing about Edgar is he was a singer, he was a songwriter, he was a keyboard player, he was a saxophone player. He really made the sax like be a sexy thing, if really rocked it up. And see, that's another interesting guy because he could play more than one instrument.
Well, the Winter brothers, Johnny, they're both extreme talents. I was very, very, influenced. I remember I was maybe about a junior in high school.
Yeah.
And there used to be a TV show that used to come on late at night, and it was called Don Kirshner's Rock Concert.
Oh, I heard of that. Yeah, I've seen old clips of that. That's amazing.
Well, as a kid, all the bands that rocked were on that show, and I remember seeing Edgar Winter Group on that show playing live.
Yeah. And the Edgar Winter Group,
did they put on a whale of a show? And this was before Free Ride and Frankenstein and all that stuff, and because they were a successful band before they even came out with They Only Come Out at Night.
Yeah, that's.
I remember seeing that on TV.
Wow.
And man, I just got to tell you that it's like about 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Because that's like the early 70s. But they put on a show and they were on fire.
Yeah, I'll tell you the interesting thing about it is I, like a lot of people until recently, when I heard the name of Edgar Winter, those are the songs I thought of, or They Only Come Out at Night, Free Ride, obviously, Frankenstein. And much to my surprise, I was interviewing another guy for this named Mick Adams. He's the lead singer from a Rolling Stones tribute out here in L.A. And he kind of turned me on to Edgar Winter's, it was called White Trash Album. It was like the album right before They Only Come Out at Night. It sounded like two totally different things, although he's got a little bit of his rock element. It's much more of a just a great album from top to bottom.
But that's the material I'm talking about that I saw them perform when they were on Don Kirshner's rock concert.
Wow. And
and I remember they would broadcast it on KLOS as they were showing it on TV.
Yeah,
what I would do is I would plug the headphones, because it was late at night. And I'd be watching it on TV, and I would have the headphones on so I could blast it out and watch it while I was watching on TV and just blasting it out. And I remember my parents coming into the living room, and even though I had it going on headphones, they were still telling me to turn it down. That's how loud I had it.
Yeah, I mean, that's why for many years when I think of Edgar Winter, that's the song I think of as Free Ride. Great classic rock song. Who hasn't heard it a million times on the radio? But I tell you, I can't tell you how amazed I was to learn that's actually Ronnie Montrose on the guitar on that. Wow.
Well, I think when I saw that live
video,
I think it was Ronnie Montrose that was playing guitar with them when I saw him on Don Kirshner's, because he did a guitar solo that was just on fire.
Yeah, Edgar Winter. I mean, he had Ronnie Montrose, and then a lot of another guitar player he worked a lot with throughout his career was Rick Derringer.
Yes, and that's rock and roll hoochie coo.
Yeah, there you go.
I think that back in the 60s, I think either Johnny Winter or the Winter Brothers and Rick Derringer were in a band together called the Real McCoys.
Oh, I heard that. Yeah, somebody was telling me that. I had to check that out. I never got a chance to listen.
That was my first becoming aware of those guys, because that was stuff that was coming out back in the 60s, but it rocked.
Oh yeah, and so getting back to kind of your influences, Gar, which we're all over the place, but that's kind of why I've been doing this with you, because it's so much fun to hear about all these like very different influences. Now, the first one we talked about was obviously Alice Cooper, and I was kind of interested in that because I'm an Alice fan like you, but I'm into the theatrics, I'm into the songs, I'm into the lyrics and everything. And in talking to you about Alice Cooper, you were telling me, well, it was really just the songwriting, and I was really into the songs. The image and the theatrics didn't really kind of matter to me. And then we talked to you about Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. And Pink Floyd is very, very different from Alice Cooper in that I would say Pink Floyd, especially Dark Side of the Moon, is really kind of thinking man's music. Like you tell me, well, you got to really listen to the lyrics. You got to really listen to what they're doing, which is very true. And then we talked about Black Sabbath today, which is another great band. I mean, they're one of my all-time favorites, as you can tell. And Black Sabbath, though, very different sounding. I mean, they were kind of really anti-image. And I seen which brings me to my next point. I seen a great picture of you, like from the '80s when you're doing your original music thing. You were, you had your bass on, you had the leathers on. You were looking quite the rock star. So talk about going from being like influenced by a band like Black Sabbath to you go doing your own original thing, and you're trying to get down the look. I mean, you have the look, man. But talk about how important that was for you at the time.
Well, back in the 80s, if you were trying to get signed to a record label, it became very obvious to me that record labels were not looking for another Black Sabbath another Bon Jovi or another this or another that. Or another Journey, because I just noticed when I was playing in LA that you would go see this band and they would be doing originals, but you're listening to it and it goes, well, it sounds like Journey.
Yeah.
Or you would go see this other band and they're playing originals and they sound like Black Sabbath. Or they were doing original material, but you could totally see that the heavy they basically sounded like that band.
Yeah,
and a record company is not looking for another Journey or another Black Sabbath or another this or another that. Record companies were looking for the new thing.
Yeah, I mean,
something that stood on its own.
Yeah.
And once that became obvious to me, I had that influence my bass playing. And that also had an influence on how I would dress, because when I would go see bands back in the 80s, it just seemed that all the other bands that I would go see would have like black leather and spikes and, this whole, it just like you go from one band to the next band to the next band, and it just seemed all, black leather and spikes, and it just, everybody was copying this and everybody was copying that.
So, you kind of went the other way.
When I decided, if I was going to come up with a look, rather than it being, the same thing that everybody else was doing, I wanted to interject color.
Yeah. Well, that's
into what I was doing, but yet have it not be so, not rock.
Yeah,
See, I mean, if I was going to introduce color, it still had to be rock.
So you had a rock look, definitely, to the photo I'm talking about that you posted the other day. But I mean, there's no mistaking. I mean, I didn't think you were the bass player for a Flock of Seagulls or something like that. You definitely had a rock element to what you were doing, and I think that's another thing. Talking about trying to make it a musician back in the 80s and that. You may very well have the talent, may very have the skill, and be the best bass player anybody's ever heard, but image was a big part of that. Like, you could be the most skilled technician on your instrument, and you could write the greatest songs, but, if you send a package out and they don't think you got the right look, they're not even going to bother with you.
Well, that was part of it. The record labels were looking at bands, not just the music, but the marketability of it.
Yeah.
And so of course I was looking at everything, and even my bass playing. When I would do bass solos back in those days, and my bass solos were much more heavily influenced by what guitar players were doing, and I was doing like Van Halen hammers on the bass.
Wow!
And and things like that. And I was doing there was a band called Night Ranger, and one of the guitarists in the early 80s was doing a guitar solo, and not Brad Gillis, but the other guy. And when he would do his guitar solo, he would do multi-finger hammer-offs.
I think you're talking about Jeff Watts.
Yeah, he would be using two hands, and instead of picking, he would be utilizing two hands rather than one hand, and just kind of doing. And I was doing that on the bass.
Wow.
So because everything that I approached that I was doing at that time, I wanted to be different than every other bass player. And so when I would be doing my thing, and then I was introducing distortion on the bass. And part of my bass solo is I would be running back and forth on the stage, hitting my bass.
Yeah.
And with like massive amounts of distortion, where it literally sounded like thunder.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
And it was usually at the very end of my bass solo, and I would just be literally, hitting, and I'd be playing through SVT bass amps, which are very big, powerful bass amps with massive amounts of distortion coming out of it, and it literally sounded like thunder, and it was kind of a dramatic end to the bass solo.
Yeah.
And and nobody else was doing anything like that at that time.
Wow! And let me ask you, I don't know if you remember the band you were in at the time. Was it your band? Was it another band you had joined?
It was an original band that I was in. I think shoot.
Well, the point.
I had a picture recently on Facebook of that band where me and the rest of the guys are taking a picture in a hallway, and I'm wearing like a tiger print shirt.
Yeah, I gotta take a look at that.
It was that band, and I for the life of me, I can't remember the name of the band.
Wow.
But yeah, during that time, that's when I was doing like those bass solos.
Yeah.
And
wow.
Like I said, it was like nothing that anybody else was doing. But the whole reason was if you're going to be taken seriously as a musician, whatever you're doing has to stand out on its own. Not another this bass player or not another that bass player. You had to be kind of paving your own road.
On that note, let me ask you, my next question was going to be, as important as the look was to be a successful band back then, or even get a record deal or come close to it, that band in particular, how much were you allowed to kind of come up with your own look, your own image, or was it more of a case that you wanted everybody in the band to kind of have a band look, kind of coordinate your outfit, so to speak, or were you allowed to be an individual?
Well, just as long, the only feedback that I would get from the other guys is if it didn't look rock, because it's a rock band, and if it didn't really tie into what the other guys were doing, and the other guys seemed to be influenced by what I was doing, so there was kind of pieces of what I was doing they were doing, and so it really wound up tying together.
Now you kind of, I know when you post those pictures, sometimes you have a good laugh at yourself because it's like, wow, that's what we looked like back then in the 80s, but I would say it probably really helped prepare you for doing the rock tribute thing that you're doing now.
Who better to do a tribute to a band from the 80s than a person that was actually doing it back in the 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, what makes it more a kind of a comfort zone for me is because the band, maybe I'm not doing original material anymore. I'm doing somebody else's material and I'm dressing up like somebody else, but it's being brought to life on stage by somebody that was actually in Los Angeles
at that time.
That was playing at that time, the same time. I believe Slash in the early '80s was playing in a band called Black Sheep.
Wow!
And this is before he was. I believe he played with London.
Yeah.
And then went on to Guns N' Roses, but I think originally he was in a band called Black Sheep.
Wow,
way before that, and I was around in Los Angeles at that time too, and so Guns N' Roses is from Los Angeles. I'm from Los Angeles.
And
Guns N' Roses was playing in Los Angeles. I was playing in Los Angeles.
Very good.
Who better to bring that to life on stage?
See, the reason I asked that is because when I think of tribute bands, like I said, it takes a huge talent to do what you do, Gar, you and your bandmates, but it really is rock and roll theater. So, I mean, the point I was making, not so much that it helped you to learn how to dress like Axl Rose, but just, the importance of having that rock star look, if you know what I mean. I imagine, back in the days when you dress like that and you were in these bands, I'd imagine anytime you send a demo or something to a record label, or you guys probably like they did back in the day. I mean, I remember even seeing things like to join the Kiss fan club. This is days before the internet. This is years before the internet. Everything done was through snail mail. You do because you're great at marketing, but again, this is pre-internet. I know you do all the advertising for your band and your website these days, but even back in the day, do you send anything to a label or even a potential manager or anything like that, you guys have to take promo photos. You have to look really professional, you know, if you want anybody to take you serious.
Yeah. Yes. But like if everybody wanted to get signed to a record label at that time, and everybody that was playing in a band at that time was very, very serious about it.
Yeah.
I was, at that time, but virtually everybody in all of these different bands that were playing in Los Angeles, and at that time, way back in the 80s, it was a literal ocean of bands that were, playing in Los Angeles at that time, and virtually all of these guys, were very, very serious about what they were doing. Not a lot, the cream rises to the top.
Yeah, and people laugh at stuff when they look at old pictures of these 80s bands, but like I've heard Nikki Sixx say, like, if you look on the album cover for Shout at the Devil, that's why he had that big hair back in the day. That's why he put on that makeup. That's why he had all the dark colors. He was doing anything and everything to get people to notice not just his band, but himself. That's why, he was, a lot of times back in the days, he was the one that the photographer was taking pictures of, because he had the look. He had the rock look or whatever, and he was purposely doing that, to just make people take notice of him.
Want me to tell you a story about David Lee Roth and somebody talking to me about Van Halen years before they got signed?
Sure.
This is back in the 70s, before their album came out in 79.
Yeah.
I think it was maybe about 77 or something like that. And, there was a big talk about town about Van Halen at that time. I mean, there was a lot of people talking about Eddie, so somebody that I knew went and saw, I hadn't seen them in concert yet, and a friend of mine went and saw them.
Wow.
And so I was asking them, well, what did you think? And they go, yeah, they're a really good band, and Eddie's a really good guitarist. And then I go, well, what about the singer? And the guy goes, oh, that guy's a jerk. And I go, well, what do you mean? What is it that you didn't like about him? You know what the guy said?
What?
Oh, that guy thinks he's a rock star.
Well, look at what he went on to become,
Well, what's the moral of the story?
Yeah, he did his own thing.
The moral of the story is you have to believe you're a rock star.
Yeah, and he definitely does. I mean, can't argue with that.
It's the truth. Yeah. If you're ever going to, attempt to do that whole thing, being a lead singer and being in the front of people and doing all of those things and that you do, being the front man, you have to believe you are a rock star.
There you go. Yeah.
And I never forgot that. That's so many years ago, but I remember that because that stuck in my mind.
All these years, yeah.
Yes.
Well, Gar, I want to thank you. I can't believe we chatted for over an hour again. It's been a ton of fun. It's been a ton of fun, but that's what I love. You and me, we got all this love for this music and stuff. So we'll be talking to you again real soon, and I think the next time we're going to really get into talking. We did a little today about Edgar Winter, because you also included They Only Come Out at Night, and that's one of my favorite albums. So I'd love to kind of expose more people to that.
Well, thank you. I can't thank you enough, Jason. It's always a pleasure.
Okay.
I just hope I don't talk too much.
No, that makes it interesting, man. Okay, you have a good day. I'll be in touch with you. Bye bye.
Take care.